Hello, good morning. My name is Rafael Echevarne. I'm the Director General of ACI Latin America and the Caribbean. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you to this chat webinar, whatever you want to call it, because technically it's not a webinar, but it's more of a chat. That's because of technical reasons. But anyway, the important thing is that you are all connected to this very interesting topic of the fundamentals of airport charges, and in particular, how these airport charges are calculated. I wanted to be present on this webinar because of the importance of the topic. Airport charges, as you probably know, is one of the most contentious issues when it comes to the relationship between airports and airlines. And hence the reason why we were very happy when one of the airports in the Caribbean actually asked us to cover this topic. And so we suggested the possibility of organizing this chat/webinar to discuss the topic with two experts in the field. We have with us Trick Lucas, who is Director of Economics at ACI World in Montreal. He's not with us right now. He will join later. But even more important is the fact that we have Carlos Charpenel, who is the Director of Economic Policy at ACI World, also based in Montreal, and Gonzalo Ibarra, who is Director General of Ibarra Aero Charges. That is the name of his company. And as you can gather, it is a company that specializes in airport charges. And he's a very active consultant with ICAO and other organizations, multilateral agencies around the world. So the plan here is for Carlos to kick off the discussion, and then Gonzalo will go into more details. Now, you won't be surprised to hear, as I was saying before, this is a very important topic, and it is a topic that is being discussed at the highest level in ICAO. And this very year, we are going to be putting forward as ACI our view on the topic. And I'm sure that Carlos will be covering that in detail. The way we are going to divide today's discussion is going to be first half, these two presentations, and then the second half, we will be opening the floor for any questions that you may have. One very important thing to point out, please have your microphones on mute, because of the fact that this is not technically a webinar. We wanted to actually allow you to speak, but only please do so in the second half of the discussion, so that we can open the microphones and let you speak as you wish. We just ask you to raise your hand when it comes the time for that. Francisco will point out when that is the case. So without further ado, I'll stop here. Thank you very much for your participation. And please, Carlos and Gonzalo, go ahead, Carlos.
Thank you, Rafael. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. So give me 1 second. Okay, so everyone can see my screen now. Perfect. All right, so as Rafael was just saying, this morning we're going to talk about airport charges and give you a brief introduction to the topic of calculating airport charges. So my name is Carlos Charpenel. I'm the Director of Economic Policy at ACI World. And alongside my colleague, Patrick Lucas, we're gonna be discussing this very important issue. Now, let's begin by defining what airport charges are. So airport charges are fees assessed by airports for their services they provide to their customers. And as you know, airports provide a wide variety of services, all the way from runways and taxiways to terminals, car parking facilities, parking stands for airlines, etc. So airport charges are a very important part of the operation of an airport because they help to finance and fund all these activities. So they are a fundamental part of the day-to-day operations of an airport. Now, revenues generated by airport charges can be divided into two main categories. First, we have aeronautical revenues, which before the pandemic made up 54% of all industry revenues on a worldwide scale. This number is higher in Latin America, nearly 70%. And on the other hand, we have non-aeronautical or commercial revenues, which in 2019 made up 40% of all revenues. However, the most important and the key part here is the passenger, because passengers represent the aeronautical fees that they pay represent 29% of all revenues. And if you add up that amount to the 40% of commercial revenues, you get that passengers are responsible for nearly 70% of all airport revenues. So they are a key part in this whole aviation value chain. Now, as I was mentioning, airport charges can be divided into two main categories. First, we have aeronautical or regulated revenues, which, depending on the type of economic regulation that exists at the different airports, can be regulated or unregulated. You can have a dual till system in which aeronautical revenues fall under certain rules and regulations, while non-aeronautical or commercial revenues are completely unregulated. And then you can also have single till systems in which both aeronautical and non-aeronautical revenues are regulated. Now, in terms of the different types of aeronautical revenues that we have, these are just some examples, but they include landing fees, aircraft parking fees, passenger fees, but there are many other fees that airports can use to charge for the services they provide. Now, in terms of non-aeronautical or commercial revenues, this is a segment that has been growing quite a lot in the past few years, especially in Latin America and the Caribbean, because this is a segment that was underdeveloped, but the last 2 decades, airport operators have been putting a lot of work and a lot of effort into developing this category. Now, some examples of charges and avenues within the commercial revenues category include car parking revenues, real estate, which can include the leasing of space inside the terminal and outside the terminal, but you also have some others like advertising, like VIP lounges, etc. Now, before we get into the actual mechanics of how to calculate airport revenues, it is important to consider that airport charges represent on average only 5.1% of a ticket's cost. And this is important because lately there's been this myth around airport charges saying that they are very high and that they represent a huge percentage of a ticket's cost. But last year, we at the ACI World conducted this research study, and we found out that on a global scale, airport charges only represent 5.1% of a ticket's cost. So it's important to consider this information. And also, for airlines, airport charges do not represent a huge percentage of their expenses, of their costs. On average, they only represent 3.1% of an airline operational expenditures. So also from the airline perspective, they are not very high. Now, let's get into the actual mechanics of how to calculate airport charges. And this is just a simplified version of the whole process, because this is, to be honest, a very complex process. So we're just trying to summarize it. So the first step is to determine what your costs are, what your expenses are. And an airport, as you know, can have many different types of expenses. You can have wages and salaries. You can have utilities like electricity, water, heating. You can also have supplies for maintenance, etc. So once you determine your cost, your expenses, you have to allocate or distribute those expenses among the different cost centers within an airport. And an airport can have also many cost centers. You can have administration, you can have in-terminal operations, airside operations, rescue and firefighting services, etc. So once you distribute those expenses among the different cost centers, you have to establish cost bases for individual charges. So for example, if you're trying to calculate your landing fee, you have to consider all the different costs involved in the actual activity of landing. So the runway maintenance, the wages for the workers that are gonna keep the airfield clean, the supplies to clean the runway, etc. Once you do that, you have to allocate the cost base to the different user categories. And it's important to consider that an airport has many different types of users. So you can have general aviation flights, you can have cargo operators, you can have commercial passenger airlines, and many others. And it's important to consider that a general aviation flight, for instance, is not going to use the commercial passenger terminal, so they should only pay for the services that they are using. And the final step is to calculate the final fees based on a projected number of passengers and a projected traffic. So in a nutshell, this whole process can be summarized with the formula that we see on the lower part of the slide, which is aeronautical charges are equal to capital expenditures plus operational expenditures plus cost of capital divided by traffic, and traffic is passengers and cargo. So basically, your expenses divided by your traffic is going to give you your aeronautical charges, which is the formula that many regulated airports in Latin America and the Caribbean use. However, this formula is very rigid and it limits the flexibility under which airports can operate. So it is not the ideal formula. Also, there's an issue with it because it limits future investments. The capital projects that are considered within their formula usually have a very short or medium-term vision on them. So for longer-term infrastructure projects, it's difficult to consider them within this formula. Also, there's an issue with risk management because during good times, airlines benefit from having more traffic and in turn lower fees. But during difficult times, it is complicated to change charges from one day to the next. So for instance, during the pandemic, many airports were stuck with fixed charges, so they had to incur in considerable losses based on this formula. Now, another important point to consider is the 4 key charging principles, which were defined by ICAO, by the International Civil Aviation Organization. And these principles are non-discrimination, cost-relatedness, transparency, and consultation. So non-discrimination means that both foreign and national users should be charged the same amount of money for the different types of charges. Cost-relatedness means that users should bear their fair share of the cost of the cost of providing the services. So for instance, here we have an example of a 747 versus a Cessna, and a 747, when it uses the airport, it has a lot of more wear and tear on the runway and the parking stands, etc. So fees should be different for a user that's going to have a higher impact on the airport compared to a user that is not going to have a significant impact. Point number 3, which is transparency, is that charges should be simple, transparent, and easy to understand for the users. They shouldn't be extremely complicated. And finally, consultation means that the users, meaning the airlines, need to be consulted on the different types of charges, and their opinion should be taken into account when defining the charges scheme for an airport. Now, the problem so far with the process that we've looked at is that it only focuses on one side of the equation, which is the supply side or the cost side. It fails to take into account the demand side. So let me give you an example of this. In the Caribbean, especially, you have many airports that are leisure-oriented or that cater for a tourism market. And these airports are usually congested in very specific times of the day, around noon, because many airlines want to arrive and depart from the airport around that time. However, Earlier in the morning and later in the afternoon, airports are not used at all. So one thing that airports could implement is basically giving a discount for airlines to use the airport during times in which infrastructure is available, so that those congested periods, those peak periods can dissipate. So this is taking into account price signals and demand elements to get rid of the issue of congestion. Another instrument that they could use is incentives to increase connectivity, to be able to attract new airlines and new flights. Also, there's commercial agreements, which can happen between the airport operator and the airline, in which you implement different risk sharing mechanisms, so that if the airline is doing very well, if they're having a good performance, they could have a lower fee, and vice versa. And finally, another important point to consider is the option to have bundled or unbundled charging schemes. So a bundle type of charge is basically one that considers different fees. So an airport could have potentially one fee that includes the landing fee, the parking fee, and the fee to use the air bridge, just within one simple charge. But at the end of the day, airports should have the option to have either unbundled or bundle schemes. Now, finally, as Rafael just mentioned in the introduction, we at ACI World are working alongside the International Civil Aviation Organization to update the current global frameworks on airport charges. And this means updating document 9082, which is the document that contains these frameworks. Now, this document, I encourage you to read it. It's got some very good, very interesting elements that you could potentially implement within your airport. However, it hasn't been updated in the past 15 years. And with all the different changes that have occurred within the industry, with the growth of competition, but also with the pandemic, it was evident for us that this document needed to be changed. So we at the ACI World are working towards updating this document to include more elements that make it more flexible and responsive. So if you are interested in getting to know the work that we're doing with our ICAO colleagues, reach out to us and we could talk to you about all these different Doc 9082 related topics. So that's it for me. Thank you. And as Rafael said, we're going to have some time at the end of the next presentation for Q&A.
Thank you very much, Carlos. So we will now pass on to Gonzalo. Gonzalo, please, if you're ready, go ahead.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks, Rafael, for the invitation to this discussion on principles of airport charges calculation. My name is Gonzalo Ibarra. I'm the General Director of Ibarra Aero Charges. We have been helping airports with the establishment of their charges and the review of their charges process. So this presentation has has two parts. The first part, we're gonna have a little bit deep into the cost allocation process for the airports. And the last one, we're gonna have one slide on the different issues that we have encountered sometimes when establishing the process for different airports. Okay, so on the first slide, wait a second. Okay, so here we have the first slide. So this is about the current airport business and economic regulations. So we have on one side the ICAO. ICAO has very specific policies towards the member states when it comes to the establishment of the airport charges. It is important to mention that these are policies as opposed to standards, which are needs to be implemented in every country, or recommended practices as well. So on these public policy objectives for airport charges, ICAO tries to minimize the risk of anti-competitive practices among airports, improve the transparency in the application of the airport charges, ascertain the capacity investment that airports must meet in order to cope with increasing demand, and finally protect the interest of passengers and other users. Going to the next slide, as it was mentioned in the presentation before, we have Article 15 of the Chicago Conventions, which calls for the application of three basic principles. First, they apply uniform conditions to international civil aviation. Second, it's rigorous no discrimination between international carriers and domestic carriers. And third, no charging for overflying a territory or enter a territory. Later on, these policies have been embedded into the document 9082 with the four main principles of non-discrimination, transparency, consultation with users, and cost relatedness. So what is cost relatedness? So cost relatedness, as in the document, it is desirable that all users shall ultimately bear their full and fair share of the cost of providing the airport. Okay, so this is actually very reasonable, what is stated. The key components of the cost relatedness is that, okay, it is desirable, it should be applied on international airports, and of course, the full and fair share of the cost. So what does it mean for an airport user to share the full and fair share of the cost? Well, here is where all the process for establishing the airport charges has led to a methodology by which these costs are allocated among the different services at the airport. On the next slide, we see that this cost allocation process is basically an exercise internal within the airport to identify three main things. On the one hand, we have the cost, right, which is your OPEX and your CAPEX, right? So basically what you have to do, you have to take the financial accounting where you have this cost established, right? Then you need to identify, okay, so what are the services that we provide at the airport? And then you have to figure, okay, are these services aeronautical or are these services non-aeronautical? There's going to be very clear examples, like, for example, the rescue and firefighting services are clearly aeronautical services, even though depending on the airport and everything, they might be required to assist off-airport emergency and so on. In the case of non-aeronautical services, we have the car parking for the land side of the airport. That's pretty clear. However, when it comes to bespoke services that are provided by for example, the engineering or maintenance department of the airport, it's not very clear whether the service is aeronautical or non-aeronautical. So you might have departments that provide both of those services. And then the third key exercise where the cost allocation method is applied is to the areas. The areas of the airport are really important. As we all know, you have the airfield, which includes the runways, the taxiways, the taxi lanes, the aprons. You then have the passenger terminals, which are usually divided into landside and airside. And then we have the road access to the airport as well, that is mainly landside. And then you have other areas as well. So it is important to know as an airport, okay, so who provides a service? Is it, for example, aviation security? Does the airport provide the service? Does the airport, or is it another different company that's providing the services? Say, for example, in some countries, you do have airport police, which have the authority to arrest people at the security controls. So it's different. It's a different setup between each and every country. The second question, well, who are my users? To whom the services provided? Am I providing a service to the airlines? Am I providing a service to a charter operator? Or am I providing the service to the community? For example, many airports have community programs where some community programs are social, other community programs are environmentally. So you also need to understand, okay, what's the cost for me to provide these services as well? Are those costs really, should those costs really be bear by the airlines or by the passengers coming to the airport? I don't know. It depends on everyone's situation. And then, like the last question, okay, where are the services provided? You might have aeronautical services that are provided outside of airport boundaries. For example, if you need to test ILS systems and so on. So it's a very dynamic process where we usually involve from the finance department of the airport, we usually involve all the other departments, engineering, marketing, commercial, and so on. Okay, so in the next slide, once the cost bases have been identified is where you can start adjusting those cost bases to exclude non-passenger paying, non-revenue passenger. You can also, in principle, should also exclude as well exempted flights. For example, flight schools. Usually in many countries, flight schools are exempted or they have really good discounts in order to foment the education of their personnel in aviation. You also have military, state, or government facilities. There are many airports in the region, in the Americas, as well as some airports in Europe where you share the facilities with the military. So what's the extent of the cost? I mean, do we have to bear the cost for the military facilities? What's the arrangement? And so on and so on. So over there, you start to develop your cost basis. You will have cost basis, for example, for the airfield, whereas you will start developing your landing, parking, lighting, or approach charge. You would have an adjusted cost basis for the terminal where you can get into create your domestic passenger facility charge or your international passenger facility charge. Same can be said for aviation security. If you have a cargo terminal as well, how are you going to charge for the services you provide on that terminal? Or if the terminal it's been concessioned by a third party, should you provide any services? Are you going to recover those costs? And same for environmental charges. I mean, what's the cost for the airport to providing environmental measures? For example, some airports in Europe, they do provide assistance to their communities in order to reduce airport noise around the airport. These are all environmental charges that should also have their own cost base, or usually have their own cost base. And then finally, you would input all of these. You will have your cost basis plus your traffic. You will look at your traffic historically, and then you will look at your traffic forecast for the next 10 or 15 years. And then once you have your charges levels and your set of charges, you then go to the consultation process with the users, follow up by approval and publishing, which depending on the airport, it can take some time, the approval or the publishing process as well. So it's usually a process where, I mean, you usually have somebody taking care of the charges within the finance department, and then they will be reviewing and assessing on a constant basis. And depending on the situation, of course, let's say every 5 years, the charges can get updated and so on. And then finally, these are some of the situations presented or that could be presented. For example, we have airports where there's multiple layers of approvals for the charges. So it's not only for the airport setting up the charges, establishing, going to consultation and everything, but you might find that those charges need to be approved from another public entity. This is the case in Latin America with some of the airports that have been privatized or given to concession agreements. The second case, for example, we have lack of processes for approving, consulting, and publishing. It might be the case that sometimes the airport authority doesn't know, or the functions of the management and the functions of the board are not really clear into who's the one that is to approve them or publish them. Then we also have the case, of course, of some aeronautical services not being properly charged. This would be the case, for example, well, I mean, as long as you continue to improve your billing, you will be able to get the services, or some services that you didn't know you provided, you can now start billing for them. You also have the case of aeronautical assets not being properly identified. This would be an example if you have a specific apron for general aviation, right? It might be that not always you have to charge if you tell some commercial aircraft to park over there or not. So sometimes these aeronautical assets or some stands are not being clearly identified as billable. And then, well, we also said before, you have some charges approved by different authorities. You have in Latin America some airports where you have the runway that's handled by one concession or operator, and then you will have the runway handled by another operator. So then you will have like two approval charges process, one for the runway and the other one for the terminal, which sometimes may overlap or sometimes may not overlap. And then on top of that, like in the previous presentations, we have to be mindful of the multiple taxes that are included in the air fee, in the airline tickets, on top of the airline fares and on top of the airport charges. Sometimes these taxes might really increase the price of the tickets, which at the end can put the airport in a most or more or less favorable competitive position within the region. And that's all. Thank you very much for your time. And we're gonna open the session for questions. So I give here to Rafael, sorry.
Hello. Yes, if you can actually disconnect. There you go. Fantastic, Gonzalo. Gentlemen and ladies, as you can see, this is a rather complicated process, because it's not really straightforward as in taking the costs and dividing them by the traffic, which would be the first approach that many of us would take. But there are many different aspects that have to be considered. One of them, by the way, and I must apologize if it has already been mentioned, is the whole thing about the return on investment. The cost of capital and all that, which is actually something that ICAO, by the way, does recognize in the document 9082. But anyway, I will not just take more of your time. It is now 9:34, so we have until the top of the hour for any of your questions, because I'm sure that you have many. So Francisco, I think that we just go ahead and ask them to raise their hand, and then we give them access, or how does it work?
Yes, that's correct. In case you want to make any questions to the panelists, to Carlos or Gonzalo, please raise your hand and we will give you the floor to make the question.
So whilst you are thinking of the question.
Yeah, we have one from Keith Thompson.
There you go. Please go ahead.
You can open the mic.
Yeah, good morning. Thanks for the presentation. Just for Carlos to go back to his slide on the formula for the aero charges.
You want Carlos to show the slide?
Yes.
Carlos, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. Just give me 1 second. Okay, I think you can see it now.
Not yet. Carla, maybe you should stop sharing so Carlos can open it.
There you go. Perfect. Is this the slide you wanted?
Yes, that's the slide.
Please go ahead.
Just for clarification, a simple question, just for clarification. on the last variable in the formula, CC.
Oh yeah, that's cost of capital.
Oh, cost of capital, okay.
That is precisely what I was referring to.
Okay, thanks. I probably have missed it during your presentation. I don't know if you had mentioned it. So I just wanted clarity. Thank you very much.
No problem.
Thank you, Keith. Now it's the turn of Glender Francois. You can open the mic. Glender?
Yes, good morning, everybody. Well, I am from St. Vincent and the Grenadines, from the wonderful Argyle International Airport, AIA, just so you know. I am Glenda Francois, the Marketing and PR Manager. My question has to do with non-aeronautical revenue, and specifically, if you have data for the Caribbean and Latin America in relation to how VIP and CIP lounges, their rates and calculated, if that is possible to share with us at some point.
Did you get that, Carlos?
Yeah, it's a very good question. For those type of services, the rates are determined by the market. If you're talking about a system where you have a dual till form of regulation in which commercial revenues are not regulated, then it is up to the operator of the VIP lounge to decide which price they're gonna set for the users. But at the end of the day, it is the market that is gonna respond to that price. So it should be, it should consider those market elements for it to be attractive enough to be profitable, but also attract enough volume. So there's not a specific formula for that. So it's up to the operator of the lounge.
Okay, thank you. And do you have any data across the region?
We have data for commercial revenue per passenger, per airport, per size. So as I was mentioning in my presentation, commercial revenues in Latin America and the Caribbean is an area that is beginning to develop. But in general, per passenger, we're talking about around $5 in Latin America and the Caribbean of commercial revenue. And within those $5, you have to consider all the different streams of revenue, like car parking, leasing of space, etc. So we don't have the exact figure for VIP lounges, but we could potentially calculate a proxy if you want, and get in touch with us afterwards and we could do something about it.
Glender, we do have some research that we've done in ACI Latin America, and I will be very happy to share that with you. You're basically asking the prices for lounges, correct?
Yes, correct.
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
So you have my email, don't you, Glender? Because
yes,
you are, as you say, okay. I saw you recently in wonderful St. Vincent. Now, one comment here, Glender. Remember, and this is actually for all of you. Every year, ACI undertakes survey, an economic and financial survey for all the member airports. It's very, very important that you all participate in this survey, because it is precisely this survey what actually allows us to have this information, and it actually allows us to undertake comparisons, benchmarkings, and what have you. Now, one thing that I just wanted to reassure you is that this survey is absolutely confidential. In other words, we do not share the individual airport data with anyone. So I would say to you, please participate in that survey, because as I say, it's for the benefit of all of us. Having said that, Glender, don't worry. I will actually contact you with the information on the VIP lounges, and maybe Carlos can provide that also to you. Do you have my email, Glender? I think that you do.
Yes, I do.
Send me an email. Okay, so I see that Patrick has joined in. Sorry, anything else, Glenda, from your side?
No, that's okay for me.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions by anyone? And if Patrick wants to say something, that would really be very good too. I don't know if there are any other questions, Francisco?
Yes, they are, but
Marcos?
maybe we can let.
Please.
Yeah, we have Edgar, just to follow the order. Edgar Stephen, if you can introduce yourself, that would be better, please.
Good morning, everyone. Edgar Stephen, Airport Manager, UNORA International. That's in St. Lucia. I just had a very basic question. Some airports exist in its actual being is within a statutory body overseen more or less by central government. In our case particularly, some of these rates are set by, or the central government would have the final word. We also exist within the Caribbean region where the rates are also comparable across the different islands. In terms of hitting the right mark on the rate and in selling it to our stakeholders, is there a particular method that you would want us to take in terms of doing that?
That is an excellent question. Very good. And I think that since Patrick is already on the call, maybe Patrick, did you hear that? You want to say something about that?
Yes, good. Thank you. And good morning, everyone. Yeah, I mean, I think the basis for the calculation stems from what we saw earlier in the presentations, right? There is really the cost side that, like any other business, you need to be able to recover your costs, right? But one important aspect, and this is where the business of airports is changing, is really capturing what is happening in the market and allowing airports to operate their infrastructure in an efficient manner through the price mechanism. We've seen this in many jurisdictions across the globe where the charges are set, from over a decade ago, and obviously the marketplace has changed, and the pricing needs to be changed accordingly. The same way, an airline tries to fill up its aircraft, it's actually pricing in real time. It's pricing based on elasticity. Now, I'm not suggesting that airports do this all in real time, but there needs to be more flexibility, allowing airports to capitalize on different efficiencies. So this is something that we're engaging in with governments. So whether an airport is public or private, really the philosophy is that the infrastructure is used more efficiently through the price mechanism.
So yes, just to add on to what Patrick just said, it is a very important philosophical change of mind, all right? I mean, we have seen that governments in many parts of the world have really intervened in setting the charges, maybe because they have been influenced by some actors in suggesting that the charges should be low and shouldn't change because, the destination may suffer as compared to other parts of the world. And that is not really the type of charges that, any normal business would apply, all right? So I would always say that even if you have a government that is telling you what you should charge, you as the airport management, you as the airport director or CFO should actually undertake the exercise of saying, if I had the freedom to actually set my charges, okay, what would this be? Of course, you can actually adopt different scenarios, but I think that this is a very healthy approach. But let's say, Gonzalo, you have actually been working all around the world. Have you approached, have you encountered situations like this? What are your thoughts?
Yes, I mean, especially with state-owned airports, it's like we were saying. I mean, sometimes the ultimate approval decision vests even with parliaments. I mean, depending on the country. So it is important to understand from an airport, where do you stand on your cost and how your charges are compared to the rest of the region where you are positioned. So even the internal exercise of knowing, okay, how much should I charge as opposed to how much I'm charging, or how much my Civil Aviation Authority or my Aviation Parliamentary Commission wants to charge for the next 5 years. It is important to know where you are with these two standpoints.
If you guys are interested, I think that a very good webinar that we could organize, Patrick, it would be the impact of airport charges on airline demand or passenger demand, because this is related to what we were talking about. But anyway, Patrick, you have your hands up, and then we can pass on to other participants, any questions they may have.
Yeah, maybe just to reiterate a point, I mean, you have a situation in some parts of the world where you have significant congestion, whether it's at different time of the day, different times of the year. So you have these bottlenecks, and in fact, infrastructure is being undervalued, right? The charges actually need to rise in some of those instances, and it's not to give more money to shareholders or to make airlines unhappy, but it's really to earmark that additional, say, premium during the peak times and use that for infrastructure development. So that's on the one side when demand rises high. But on the flip side, and Carlos mentioned this, the wide use, and this is becoming more prevalent, the wide use of incentives. So if an airline achieves a certain load factor, they get a rebate. So the airline is happy. The airport is happy. They offer a lower price, but they gain on volume. So, and then those people end up spending more on the non-aeronautical side of the business. It's good for the country in terms of connectivity and so on. So there's different ways the price mechanism could be used up or down that also, I mean, in some sense, at the very least, are related to the cost in some sense, but allowing for that price flexibility to either increase connectivity or factor in cases where there's bottlenecks in the system.
Thanks, Patrick. Marcos, you're next.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, sorry, I got like 10 minutes late on the meeting, but I saw the formula for that includes capex, opex, and capital cost divided traffic. Okay, that slide. I was wondering, for example, landing charges. One of the main reasons is like taking care of the runways, basically, and some other reasons, obviously. But when you have passengers and cargo, so what type of number you use in the bottom of the formula when you're talking to traffic?
Thank you, Marcos. Who wants to answer? Carlos, Gonzalo, Patrick?
Yeah, well, usually when you talk about traffic, you're basically talking about traffic units, which is either one passenger or 100 kilograms of cargo. So that's what we mean with traffic. Now, that's a very good point. You know, the fact that both cargo operators and commercial airlines use the runway. But on one hand, cargo operators use the cargo platform or the cargo facilities. So there's that distinction there. So usually what airports do is they charge the same landing fee for both cargo and passenger planes. And then they make a distinction between the parking fees for the cargo platform and for the passenger aviation platform.
Yes, yes. So the unit that you use is 100 kilos.
Exactly.
And one passenger. Okay, okay. That's what I was wondering. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcos. Thank you. Amy, I think that you were next. Amy Charles? Yeah.
Are you hearing me? Are you hearing me?
Perfect. Yes, we can. Thank you.
Yes, I think Edgar's question was very similar to mine. We operate from the same country, St. Lucia, so I think we're on the same page. The issue is that when you have two layers in terms of the complexity of getting approvals, you have first of all maybe a board of directors, and the board of directors is made up of persons who have who may have aviation influence or business in that direction as well. And then you also have the next layer of the cabinet or parliamentary approval. And then you have potentially your board saying, hey, stakeholder engagement, make sure you get buy-in. And I know, Rafa, from the last conversation, you said is inform and implement. But where you have that influence, how do you get past the influence initially of even the board, which may have persons who have aviation, I suppose, biases or whatever in terms of airlines, and you have to get past that first, and then the next step is to get to the cabinet, which now you're looking at political influence in terms of that decision.
It's a very good point, Amy. I think that it comes down to the fundamental philosophical view of the role of airports, and do they behave as infrastructure providers, or do they behave as businesses? Maybe Patrick, you want to say something about how it's done in Australia, because I mean that could be quite relevant for our friends to understand that, you know, this very rigid approach that we are talking about here in some jurisdictions is completely up to the airport basically to decide. Hi. Hello. I think one of the microphones is open. Patrick, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. No, thank you. I mean, the Australian case is quite interesting because it went from what is called a price cap or heavy-handed regulation that required a lot of these approvals, right, or very kind of prescriptive formula-driven approach, and it went to something that is a bit more light-handed in the sense, like what Raphael was saying, that the example is Sydney Airport is free to kind of set charges or enter into commercial agreements with the airlines, and this allows them to, you know, define capex triggers, define different risk sharing mechanisms, but in a decentralized way. So it's almost like a market transaction. Now, the Australian model has been in existence, so meaning this light-handed approach that the airport and the airlines negotiate on the prices. It's been in existence now for over 20 years, and the regulator has done successive reviews, and there it's called the Productivity Commission, has done 3 or 4 reviews, and time again it has been shown that the airports, the main airports there, Sydney and I think it's Melbourne, deliver on service quality, deliver on infrastructure development, and so on and so forth. And you would think that on one level, you know, it's Australia, it's an island, it's far away, maybe it has the characteristics of a monopoly, but it works. It works because you do have very strong countervailing power from the airlines, you know, specifically Qantas, that kind of keeps everything in check. So the prices are negotiated and it works. And this is, the type of model that allows airports to operate as businesses and thrive, provided that there's no abuse of a dominant position or market power in these things. So that is the Australian model. And, some jurisdictions are starting to consider that, and it's gaining momentum in different parts of the world.
Thank you, Patrick. Anudi Ortega, please go ahead.
I'm Anudi Ortega from Dominican Republic. Thanks for the amazing discussion about the airport charge. I have a simple question. In the past slide, I saw so many airports are charging or applying charge for pollution and noise. Can you share some guidelines how to calculate that? Because in the Caribbean, it's unusual to apply that. And in your experience, is a common charge in Latin America?
Okay, I think that muchas gracias, Aneudi. Thank you, Aneudi. Maybe Gonzalo, since you have been all around the world, we know that in Europe it's very common. Is it common in Latin America, in other parts of the world, like in Southeast Asia or the likes, somewhere similar to Latin America? Unmute, Gonzalo, unmute.
Yes, Rafael, it's very common in Europe to have these charges. I mean, basically they start, for example, Amsterdam Schiphol, if you come with an aircraft from an older generation that pollutes much more than one from a new generation, your landing charge is going to be way much higher. And it's basically like a penalty to bring in this aircraft, this very old aircraft, into the airport. For example, an MD-80 will pay much more than A320 or NEO. So, I mean, you also have to consider in other places, well, what's your fleet type? I mean, many countries in Latin America have modern fleets, but others have a fleet that's a bit older. So, I mean, you also have to be careful when, you know, penalizing your customers or charging them because they bring an older aircraft. In any case, I think that's what's important here is to know how these aircraft affect your services and your cost, and how are you going to recover them? Because that's basically what the charge is all about. And then in other places, I don't think it's that common to have this type of charges. I mean, perhaps there's some in Australia or some places of Southeast Asia, but it all depends on also your fleet type and how sensitive is your population to the noise. I mean, there's some airports where you have communities right next to it, and if the communities, you know, they don't get organized and start complaining about the noise, or simply many places in Latin America, there's not that many flights at night, and people don't complain, then, I mean, it's like, you know, you need to know whether you're providing them a service or not, and whether you're going to charge them for it.
Yeah, thank you, Gonzalo. Aneudi, I would like to add to what Gonzalo just said, that there are generally two types of environmental charges. One that is noise related, and the other one that is related to the emission of gases. All right. For example, in the case of Germany, the emission-related charges, are quite common. One important thing, Aneudi, here is what is the objective of actually charging more for noisy aircraft or polluting aircraft from the point of view of the gases that they emit, and how are you going to use those charges? I think that it's very important to have a strategy in place here to understand, maybe is it linked to other government, objectives or what have you. But indeed, in Latin America, it's not very common. We have reached the top of the hour. Francisco, are there any other questions? I don't see anyone else with a hands up. I am very glad that we had almost 60 people joining in this call. That means that this is a very important topic. We are, of course, as ACI Latin America, open to further webinars, discussions on this topic. Do not hesitate to send us questions in writing to myself, to Francisco, to Carla. I presume that all of you have our emails. Please, if you have any questions, please send them to us. Well, I also wanted to let you know that ACI has specific courses on airport charges, okay? And so please, if you are interested in these courses, again, write to us and we can give you more information on that. And of course, Gonzalo is has a specialized company on this very topic. And he would also be very happy to speak with you if you have any particular questions, and maybe he can provide, those services to you. Again, thank you very, very much for your participation. It is great to see that so many of you are interested in this topic. We know it's a very important topic, and we want to keep on talking about it. And we will actually have this very same webinar in Spanish at a later date. Francisco, any more from your side or any of the participants? Gonzalo, Carlos, Patrick?
No, from our side, we will be sharing these slides, and this webinar is being recorded, and we are going to upload it to our YouTube channel. As soon as it's ready, we will share it with you.
Thank you. So if there is nothing else from our participants, Carlos Charpenel, Patrick Lucas, and Gonzalo Ibarra, thank you very, very much for this very interesting topic. As you can see, lots of questions. We'll make sure that we share with our audience your contact points, okay? And as I say, you know, in a few more days, we will have the same webinar in Spanish for the Spanish-speaking audience in Latin America. So thank you very much to everyone. Have a very nice day, and we'll be in touch with you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you. Have a nice weekend.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you very much.
Bye.
Bye, Rafael.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Carla, you take control of these. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
No worries, Rafael. We can close it now.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.